September 1944 opened with a feeling the Allies had not allowed themselves in 5 years of war, momentum without resistance. From the beaches of Normandy to the rivers of France and Belgium, Allied columns surged forward at a pace that defied every earlier forecast. Towns fell with barely a fight. Roads once expected to be contested were found abandoned. German units retreated faster than intelligence officers could redraw their maps. For the first time since 1939, the war no longer felt fixed in place. It felt fluid. It felt short. Reports arriving at headquarters described an enemy stretched thin and exhausted. Divisions existed on paper but not in reality. Fuel shortages immobilized armor. Command structures appeared fractured, improvising rather than commanding. Prisoners spoke of confusion, of orders that contradicted one another, of a Reich losing its grip. To men who had fought through North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and Normandy, this looked like collapse, not sudden defeat, but the beginning of it. Across command rooms, maps were spread wide and marked with bold arrows. Opportunities seemed to multiply with every mile gained. Rivers once thought formidable now looked like lines to be crossed, not barriers to be feared. The old language of caution, attrition, consolidation, reserve began to fade. In its place came timelines, calendars, and estimates measured not in years, but in weeks. Some commanders spoke openly of victory by Christmas, not as a boast, but as a calculation. If the enemy was broken, speed could finish what endurance had begun. Each day saved meant fewer lives lost. Each pause risked giving Germany time it no longer deserved. Momentum itself became an argument, proof in their minds that restraint was no longer necessary. Speed felt decisive because it seemed humane. It promised an end without another winter, without another generation of casualties. But speed also demanded belief. Belief that resistance would not harden, that supply lines would hold, that nothing unexpected would intervene. And within that belief, quietly and without announcement, a decision was forming, one that would redefine confidence itself. Winston Churchill welcomed the news from the continent with measured relief, not celebration. The advance across France and Belgium confirmed what he had hoped, that Germany was weakening, but it did not erase what memory had taught him. Wars, he believed, did not end simply because they appeared ready to. Momentum could be real, but it could also be misleading. He had seen it evaporate before, replaced by stalemate or sudden reversal. Churchill's career had been shaped by moments when confidence outran reality. He remembered campaigns that promised speed and delivered disaster, plans that assumed cooperation from chance and received none. To him, progress was not proof of inevitability. It was a condition that had to be protected. Victory, in his mind, was not something achieved at the moment of advantage, but something preserved through error, delay, and misfortune. He distrusted any strategy that required perfection to succeed. War was friction by nature: weather, terrain, fatigue, miscommunication. Plans that could not absorb disruption were not bold, they were fragile. Churchill believed that strength lay in redundancy, in pressure applied steadily across many fronts, in advances that could pause without collapsing. The war, he felt, would only end when Germany was deprived of choices, not surprised into surrender. As new proposals circulated through Allied headquarters, Churchill listened closely. He did not dominate the discussions, but he weighed them carefully, asking what would happen if things went wrong rather than right. Some plans he dismissed quickly, others he tolerated with caution. Then one proposal emerged that demanded more than attention. It demanded belief. The plan promised speed where patience had reigned. It offered a decisive stroke instead of sustained pressure. Its advocates spoke of opportunity, of an enemy too weak to resist, of a war that could be finished before winter closed in. On paper, it was elegant. In ambition, it was unmatched. And to Churchill's practiced eye, it carried a familiar danger, one where success depended not on resilience, but on everything unfolding exactly as intended. Operation Market Garden arrived as an answer to the impatience of victory. It promised not another push, but a single stroke, clean, direct, and decisive. Instead of grinding forward across multiple fronts, the plan proposed to leap over German defenses entirely. If it worked, the war in the West would not be prolonged. It would be ended. At its core was a bold division of labor. Airborne forces would descend deep behind enemy lines, seizing a chain of bridges across the Netherlands before German units could react. These crossings, over canals, rivers, and finally the Rhine itself, were the keys to speed. Held intact, they would open a corridor through territory the enemy believed still secure. Along that corridor, armored forces would drive north at maximum speed. Tanks, trucks, and artillery would follow a single road, racing to link each captured bridge into a continuous advance. Resistance, it was assumed, would be scattered and disorganized. The enemy would be too stunned, too short of fuel and cohesion to mount a serious response before the breakthrough was complete. The final prize was the Rhine. Cross it, and the natural barrier protecting Germany's industrial heartland would be breached without a prolonged fight. Allied armies would stand on the threshold of the Reich, poised to split Germany open from the inside. What years of attrition had struggled to achieve, one operation might accomplish in days. Advocates spoke carefully, but the implication was unmistakable. If Market Garden succeeded, the war might end in weeks rather than months. Winter would be avoided. Casualties would be spared. History would record the moment when speed replaced endurance as the instrument of victory. On paper, the plan was elegant in its simplicity. Each part depended on the next, each success unlocking the following advance. It offered clarity in a war defined by complexity. And that clarity, so rare, so tempting, made its promise difficult to resist. By the autumn of 1944, the Allied armies were exhausted by success as much as by struggle. The advance across France had been rapid, but it had not been simple. Each mile still demanded fuel, ammunition, repairs, and men who could keep moving after weeks of near-constant pressure. The victories were real, yet they carried a familiar weight. The war was still being fought step by step, town by town, bridge by bridge. Behind the front lines, supply systems began to strain under the pace of advance. Ports were damaged or distant, rail networks broken, roads crowded with vehicles competing for space. Every additional day of conventional fighting stretched logistics further, turning momentum into a burden. To many planners, the greatest threat was no longer German resistance, but the slow suffocation of their own supply lines. In that atmosphere, leaders began to search for something cleaner, an operation that could cut through the problem rather than endure it, a breakthrough that would not simply advance the front, but transform it. What they wanted was not another battle, but an answer. Market Garden appeared to offer exactly that: speed without prolonged attrition, movement without weeks of grinding contact. Airborne forces became central to this hope. Dropped from the sky, they could bypass defenses that had taken months to break in Italy and Normandy. They promised surprise instead of siege, seizure instead of erosion. If bridges could be taken intact, the ground war could be carried forward without paying its usual price in time and blood. Optimism spread quickly through command rooms. Success bred confidence, and confidence sharpened ambition. Officers spoke of opportunity slipping away if not seized immediately. The enemy, they argued, was disorganized and vulnerable. Delay would only allow recovery. In such conversations, caution began to sound like reluctance and restraint like fear. Warnings were not absent, but they struggled to find space. Doubt did not disappear, it was simply reframed. Questions became obstacles. Objections became excuses. In a moment defined by momentum, hesitation felt more dangerous than error. Gradually, belief took hold. Not belief in victory, that was already assumed, but belief in a particular path to it. The plan did not feel reckless to those inside its logic. It felt necessary. And once belief replaced restraint, the operation no longer had to be proven. It only had to be attempted. As Market Garden moved from concept to commitment, one adjustment reshaped its character entirely. What had begun as a daring operation was quietly extended, pushed farther north, deeper into enemy territory. The change was presented as logical, even efficient. If airborne forces were already being deployed, why not use them to seize one more bridge? Why stop short of the greatest prize? Arnhem was added as the final objective. Its bridge over the lower Rhine promised not just momentum, but resolution. Capture it intact, and Allied armor would cross the river without delay. Germany's last major natural barrier in the west would be breached in a single stroke. To many planners, stopping short of Arnhem now seemed wasteful, even timid. But distance carries a cost that ambition rarely measures accurately. With each added mile, the operation grew longer and thinner. Airborne units would be scattered across a wider front. Ground forces would be required to move faster, along the same narrow corridor, with no room for delay or detour. The plan's elegance remained on paper, but its tolerance for friction began to disappear. The timetable tightened accordingly. Bridges had to be taken on schedule. Armor had to arrive precisely when expected. Weather had to cooperate. Communications had to function flawlessly. Each element became dependent on the next, not merely in sequence, but in timing. A delay at one point would not slow the plan, it would unravel it. In earlier versions of the operation, error could be absorbed. A missed objective might be compensated by another advance elsewhere. With Arnhem added, that flexibility vanished. There was no alternative route across the Rhine, no secondary crossing prepared. Success now required continuous, uninterrupted momentum from start to finish. What had once been bold, calculated risk balanced by advantage, became brittle. The margin between success and failure narrowed to hours, sometimes minutes. The plan no longer asked whether the enemy could stop it. It asked whether chance would allow it to proceed. This single decision did not merely extend Market Garden geographically. It transformed its nature. The operation ceased to be a breakthrough with options. It became a wager, placed on speed, sequence, and the belief that nothing would go wrong. As Market Garden moved from concept to commitment, one adjustment reshaped its character entirely. What had begun as a daring operation was quietly extended, pushed farther north, deeper into enemy territory. The change was presented as logical, even efficient. If airborne forces were already being deployed, why not use them to seize one more bridge? Why stop short of the greatest prize? Arnhem was added as the final objective. Its bridge over the lower Rhine promised not just momentum, but resolution. Capture it intact, and Allied armor would cross the river without delay. Germany's last major natural barrier in the west would be breached in a single stroke. To many planners, stopping short of Arnhem now seemed wasteful, even timid. But distance carries a cost that ambition rarely measures accurately. With each added mile, the operation grew longer and thinner. Airborne units would be scattered across a wider front. Ground forces would be required to move faster, along the same narrow corridor, with no room for delay or detour. The plan's elegance remained on paper, but its tolerance for friction began to disappear. The timetable tightened accordingly. Bridges had to be taken on schedule. Armor had to arrive precisely when expected. Weather had to cooperate. Communications had to function flawlessly. Each element became dependent on the next, not merely in sequence, but in timing. A delay at one point would not slow the plan, it would unravel it. In earlier versions of the operation, error could be absorbed. A missed objective might be compensated by another advance elsewhere. With Arnhem added, that flexibility vanished. There was no alternative route across the Rhine, no secondary crossing prepared. Success now required continuous, uninterrupted momentum from start to finish. What had once been bold, calculated risk balanced by advantage, became brittle. The margin between success and failure narrowed to hours, sometimes minutes. The plan no longer asked whether the enemy could stop it. It asked whether chance would allow it to proceed. This single decision did not merely extend Market Garden geographically. It transformed its nature. The operation ceased to be a breakthrough with options. It became a wager, placed on speed, sequence, and the belief that nothing would go wrong. As doubts gathered around the extended plan, military leaders responded with certainty rather than hesitation. Briefings emphasized opportunity, not risk. The enemy, they argued, was in no condition to resist a rapid thrust. German formations were described as shattered remnants, units retreating without cohesion, commanders without control. What resistance remained, they believed, would dissolve under pressure. Intelligence that complicated this picture struggled to gain traction. Reports of German armored units refitting in the Netherlands were acknowledged, then minimized. Signals intercepts were interpreted optimistically. A lack of clear enemy movement was treated as absence rather than concealment. In a climate shaped by success, uncertainty became something to be resolved quickly, not examined closely. Speed itself was framed as the plan's shield. The faster the advance, the less time the enemy would have to react. Airborne landings would disorient defenders. Armor would arrive before resistance could organize. Momentum, it was argued, was not merely an advantage, it was protection. To slow down now would invite exactly the opposition the plan sought to avoid. Churchill listened and remained unconvinced. He questioned not the courage of the troops or the skill of the commanders, but the certainty of their assumptions. War, he reminded them, had a way of rewarding the unexpected. The enemy rarely behaved according to optimistic estimates, particularly when pressed into a corner. He asked what would happen if the Germans were stronger than expected, or simply quicker to react. These questions were met with reassurance. Timetables were repeated. Confidence was reinforced. The tone of discussion shifted subtly, but unmistakably. Caution began to sound like reluctance to seize the moment. To question the plan was to risk being seen as obstructing momentum at the very point when victory seemed closest. The clash was not personal, but philosophical. Churchill measured plans by their capacity to endure failure. Operational commanders measured them by the speed of success. Both perspectives had shaped the war to this point, but here they diverged. One emphasized resilience, the other emphasized opportunity. In the end, enthusiasm carried greater weight than unease. The operation had gathered too much momentum of its own to be easily stopped. Reversing course would have required not just a change of mind, but an admission that ambition had outpaced caution. That admission was never made. The decision was not reversed. Market Garden moved forward, carrying with it the confidence of its architects and the risks they believed speed alone could overcome. On the morning of 17 September 1944, the skies over the Netherlands filled with aircraft. Transport planes droned steadily eastward, their paths crossing towns and fields that had known occupation for 4 years. Below them, Dutch civilians looked up as thousands of parachutes blossomed in the pale autumn light. For the airborne troops, the long-anticipated moment had arrived. Market Garden was no longer a plan. It was unfolding. Paratroopers and glider infantry landed across a wide arc of territory, stretching from Eindhoven in the south to the outskirts of Arnhem in the north. In many areas, surprise worked as intended. German units were caught off balance. Key road junctions were seized. Several bridges were taken intact, their demolition charges cut or abandoned in haste. For the men on the ground, the opening hours felt like validation. The plan, so carefully argued, appeared to be succeeding. Reports sent back through the chain of command reflected that early confidence. Objectives were being marked off faster than expected. Resistance, where encountered, was often scattered and light. In headquarters, optimism surged. The first phase of the operation, the most uncertain, seemed to be falling into place. Speed, it appeared, was delivering exactly what had been promised. Yet almost immediately, the first signs of strain emerged. Communications faltered as radios failed to connect across distances and terrain they had not been tested against. Units that were meant to coordinate found themselves isolated, relying on runners and guesswork. Timetables assumed clarity. The battlefield delivered confusion. Above them, the weather began to shift. Low cloud and intermittent rain interfered with follow-on drops, delaying reinforcements and resupply. Aircraft were forced to turn back or scatter. The precision on which the operation depended began to blur. What was delayed by hours at altitude would be felt for days on the ground. The airborne troops adapted as best they could, consolidating positions and pushing toward their objectives with limited information. But the plan's structure left little room for improvisation. Every delay echoed forward, affecting units farther along the corridor. Time, which had been the operation's greatest ally, began to work against it. By the end of the first day, Market Garden had achieved much, but not everything it required. The bridges that mattered most were not yet all secured. Communications remained uncertain. Reinforcements were behind schedule. The drop had begun with promise, but beneath the surface of early success, the schedule was already starting to fracture, and distance was waiting to make those fractures decisive. As airborne troops fought to hold their objectives, ground forces began the northward advance along the narrow corridor that would bind the operation together. What appeared on maps as a clean line of movement quickly revealed its limitations. Tanks, trucks, artillery, engineers, and supply vehicles were compressed onto a single raised road, flanked by flat, exposed terrain. There was no room to maneuver, no alternative route to absorb delay. Almost immediately, congestion became a threat. Disabled vehicles, damaged bridges, and the simple density of traffic slowed progress to a crawl in places. A single obstruction could halt the column for hours. Every pause rippled backward through the line, compounding delay upon delay. Speed, the operation's essential requirement, proved difficult to sustain under such conditions. German forces exploited this vulnerability with increasing effectiveness. Small, mobile units launched counterattacks against the corridor, cutting it at multiple points. Even brief interruptions forced Allied units to stop, turn, and fight, further slowing the advance. Each time the road was severed, airborne units ahead were left waiting, isolated, expending ammunition, and losing time they could not replace. At every junction, the clock became the enemy. Decisions that might have taken minutes in planning now consumed hours under fire. Engineers worked to repair bridges while infantry cleared resistance from nearby villages. None of these tasks failed outright, but none were accomplished quickly enough. The plan did not require perfection, it demanded it. Far to the north, at Arnhem, British airborne forces waited for relief that did not arrive on schedule. The delay was not dramatic, it was incremental. Hours became a day became two. Each missed deadline tightened the pressure on units already stretched thin. What had been conceived as a rapid link-up began to feel like a hope deferred. The added distance to Arnhem now revealed its true cost. Every mile multiplied the consequences of delay. What had seemed manageable in planning became oppressive in execution. The operation's extended reach turned from advantage to liability, its farthest objective growing more remote with each passing hour. By now, the shape of the gamble was clear. Market Garden no longer depended on boldness alone. It depended on time, time that was slipping away at every roadblock, every counterattack, every stalled column. And as distance hardened into resistance, the operation's most fragile assumption was exposed. That speed could outrun reality. At Arnhem, the war narrowed to streets, houses, and fields pressed tightly against the river. British airborne troops dug in wherever ground allowed, along embankments, inside brick homes, behind improvised barricades built from furniture and rubble. What had been planned as a brief hold became a prolonged defense. Each hour without relief altered the nature of their mission. They were no longer seizing ground. They were surviving on it. The appearance of German armor came as a shock, not because it was impossible, but because it had been discounted. Armored units, some refitting, others rushed forward from nearby formations, began to probe the perimeter. Tanks moved cautiously through narrow streets, supported by infantry who knew the terrain. The assumption of a disorganized enemy collapsed under the sound of engines and artillery fire. Ammunition began to run low almost immediately. Airdropped supplies fell wide or into German hands, scattered by wind and imperfect navigation. Radios failed to coordinate resupply with accuracy. What reached the defenders was rationed carefully. Every round accounted for, every engagement weighed against what might follow. Firepower became calculation. Reinforcements did not arrive as planned. Units that were meant to link up found themselves delayed by fighting farther south, by broken communications, by the slow grind of the corridor. At Arnhem, this absence was felt not as strategy, but as pressure. Positions that had been held confidently on the first day now came under sustained assault. Buildings changed hands. Defensive lines shortened. The perimeter shrank with grim logic. Each withdrawal preserved men but surrendered space. Wounded soldiers filled makeshift aid stations with dwindling medical supplies. Commanders made decisions measured in yards rather than miles. The plan's grand ambition faded into a series of immediate choices. Hold here, fall back there, survive until nightfall. The bridge itself became the focus of everything that remained possible. As long as it was contested, the operation retained a chance, however slim. But German pressure intensified. Armor and artillery concentrated their fire. Positions closest to the bridge were isolated, then overwhelmed. One by one, strongpoints were lost. When it became clear that the bridge could no longer be held, the meaning of the operation changed irrevocably. The failure was not total, courage had not collapsed, resistance had not broken, but the decisive condition had been missed. Without the bridge, there could be no crossing of the Rhine. Without that crossing, the operation could not achieve its purpose. The moment passed quietly. There was no single order that marked it, no dramatic announcement. It was recognized instead through reports, through silence, through the understanding that relief would not come in time. What had been delayed was now denied. At Arnhem, the turning point did not arrive with catastrophe. It arrived with realization. The window that speed was meant to exploit had closed. And far beyond the battlefield, the consequences of that loss were only beginning to be understood. In London, the story of Market Garden arrived in fragments. Reports came slowly, filtered through distance, damaged communications, and the instinct to emphasize progress where it could still be claimed. Early dispatches spoke of bridges taken, of airborne troops holding firm, of armored columns advancing despite resistance. For a brief moment, uncertainty allowed optimism to survive. But as hours became days, the picture sharpened. Messages from the northern end of the operation grew shorter, then more cautious. Objectives were no longer described as secured, but as contested. Timetables were adjusted, then abandoned. What had been framed as temporary delay began to reveal itself as structural failure. The decisive detail emerged with painful clarity. The operation was faltering at its furthest point. Arnhem, the final objective, was not being reinforced. The bridge over the Rhine, the condition upon which the entire plan depended, remained out of Allied control. Without it, the corridor led nowhere. The extension that had promised resolution now exposed the plan's fragility. For Churchill, this realization carried no surprise, only weight. The concerns he had raised before the operation returned with cruel precision. The dependence on sequence, the absence of alternatives, the assumption that speed would compensate for vulnerability. Each risk he had identified now expressed itself not as theory, but as loss. The mood shifted quickly. The confident language of briefings gave way to careful phrasing. Success was no longer discussed in absolutes, but in degrees. Attention turned to extraction rather than advance. Optimism, so recently abundant, receded into a disciplined silence that spoke louder than argument. There were no public recriminations, no immediate judgments. War did not allow for them. But within the rooms where decisions had been debated, the cost was now understood as unavoidable. Men were isolated. Units were being overrun. What could not be reached would have to be abandoned. Churchill absorbed the news with restraint. He did not seek vindication. The failure offered none. Strategy, to him, was never about being right in advance. It was about preventing avoidable loss. In Market Garden, that prevention had not been achieved. As plans were made to salvage what remained, one truth stood beyond dispute. The operation had not failed because it was attempted. It had failed because it was extended beyond what it could survive. As the reality of failure settled across the front, Allied commanders shifted from advance to recovery. Orders were issued quietly, without ceremony. What could be held was held. What could be saved was saved. Where neither was possible, forces were instructed to disengage and fall back under cover of night. Market Garden, once defined by speed, now moved cautiously, measuring success in survival rather than ground gained. For the airborne units, withdrawal was costly and incomplete. Many were cut off, surrounded, or too weakened to break contact. Evacuations across rivers and through flooded terrain were carried out under fire, often with limited equipment and fading strength. Those who escaped did so in fragments. Those who did not were killed or captured. The losses were severe, not because of collapse, but because endurance had been demanded longer than the plan had allowed. Objectives that had once been spoken of confidently were now released without comment. Bridges were no longer destinations, but reference points in reports of disengagement. The Rhine remained uncrossed. The corridor that had consumed so much effort narrowed again, its northern reach quietly erased from operational maps. The war returned to lines rather than leaps. In official language, the failure was softened. Statements emphasized what had been gained rather than what had been lost. Phrases like substantial progress and nearly successful entered the record. Market Garden was described as having fallen short, not as having failed. The word almost did heavy work, suggesting that success had been close enough to matter. Churchill did not accept that comfort. To him, precision in language was a form of honesty, and honesty a strategic necessity. An operation that depended on perfection and broke under strain was not almost successful. It was flawed by design. Euphemism, he believed, risked repeating the same error by disguising its cause. Privately, the reckoning was more direct. The cost of the gamble was now visible in casualty lists, in missing units, in time surrendered to an enemy that had been granted a reprieve. None of this erased the courage of those who fought. Courage was never in doubt. Judgment was. The war did not pause for reflection. Other fronts demanded attention. New plans were drawn. Winter approached. But beneath the movement of events, Market Garden left a mark that could not be ignored. It demonstrated the price of ambition unbalanced by resilience. A gamble had been taken, not recklessly but knowingly. Its failure did not end the war, but it shaped what followed. And in that outcome, Churchill saw not misfortune, but consequence. When the fighting subsided and the maps were redrawn, the most significant detail was also the simplest. The Rhine remained uncrossed. It stood where it had before Market Garden began, wide, cold, and defended, its eastern bank still beyond Allied reach. What the operation had been designed to remove in a single stroke endured as a barrier that would demand months of further fighting. For Germany, that survival mattered. Time, which had seemed exhausted in September, was returned to them in October. Units shattered in France were pulled back, reorganized, and reinforced. Defensive lines were rebuilt along rivers and towns once thought indefensible. Factories continued to produce. Commanders regained coherence. The Reich did not recover its strength, but it recovered its breath. Winter followed close behind. Rain turned roads into mud. Rivers swelled. Air support became less reliable. Movement slowed across every front. What Market Garden had promised to avoid, a prolonged campaign through harsh conditions, now became unavoidable. The initiative that had defined the summer advance dissolved into preparation for endurance. The cost in men was already fixed. Airborne units had suffered losses that could not be replaced quickly, if at all. Veterans trained for specialized operations were gone, captured or killed in ground they had been ordered to hold without relief. Their absence would be felt not only in numbers, but in experience, an erosion invisible on maps but decisive in combat. Momentum, once lost, did not return easily. The Allied advance resumed, but without the confidence that had defined September. Operations became cautious, layered with contingencies. The war resumed its familiar rhythm of pressure and resistance, progress measured in miles rather than breakthroughs. The sense that Germany might collapse suddenly faded into memory. Strategically, Market Garden altered the tempo of the war. It did not reverse Allied superiority, but it delayed its conclusion. The Rhine crossing would come eventually, but not before further campaigns, further losses, and further time. Each week gained by Germany meant additional casualties across all fronts, costs that could never be fully attributed to a single decision, yet were inseparable from it. Opportunity, once lost, rarely returns in the same form. The window that had opened after Normandy, when German defences were disorganized and Allied momentum at its peak, closed under the weight of delay. What remained was a stronger, more cautious enemy, prepared to trade ground for time with deliberate efficiency. None of this erased the bravery of those who fought. Courage had carried Market Garden further than prudence alone ever could have. But courage could not substitute for resilience built into strategy. The plan had asked too much of time, of chance, and of men already stretched thin. In the months that followed, the war ground forward through the Ardennes, across the Rhine at last, and into the heart of Germany. Victory would come, but slower, colder, and more costly than it might have been. Market Garden did not lose the war, but it reshaped its final phase. The strategic price of overreach is rarely paid immediately. It accumulates quietly, in lost options, in surrendered initiative, in seasons that must now be endured rather than avoided. By extending ambition beyond what the plan could absorb, the Allies traded speed for delay and decisiveness for endurance. The war continued, but the chance to end it early had passed. And history would remember that not all failures are defeats. Some are simply opportunities never recovered. Winston Churchill's objection to Market Garden was never rooted in timidity. It came from a philosophy of war shaped by endurance rather than surprise. He believed pressure won wars, not sudden leaps, but sustained force applied until the enemy's choices disappeared. Victory, in his mind, was not achieved by brilliance alone, but by systems that continued to function when brilliance failed. Throughout the conflict, Churchill favored strategies that compounded advantage gradually. He trusted accumulation over acceleration. Each gain was meant to support the next, not replace it. Progress that could pause, absorb loss, and resume was more valuable to him than speed that demanded uninterrupted success. War, as he understood it, was an environment hostile to perfection. This belief was not abstract. It was drawn from experience, campaigns where early promise collapsed under strain, where daring advances outran supply, coordination, or political reality. Churchill had seen how quickly fortune could turn, and how unforgiving war was toward plans that assumed favorable outcomes at every stage. Strategy, to him, was insurance against the unexpected. Market Garden violated that principle at its core. It did not merely seek advantage, it required continuity. Every element depended on the precise success of the one before it. Airborne landings had to be accurate. Bridges had to be seized intact. Ground forces had to advance without interruption. Weather had to cooperate. Communications had to function. German resistance had to remain disorganized. There was no allowance for chance, only faith that chance would comply. Churchill believed plans must survive failure, not avoid it, survive it. They had to bend, reroute, and continue even when assumptions collapsed. Market Garden offered no such resilience. Its structure converted delay into disaster. Once extended to Arnhem, it removed its own safety margins. There was no secondary crossing of the Rhine, no parallel axis of advance, no meaningful recovery if the far objective failed. The extension northward troubled Churchill more than the operation itself. Without Arnhem, Market Garden was ambitious. With it, the plan became absolute. The margin between success and failure narrowed to a sliver of time and coordination. Strategy ceased to be adaptable and became conditional. Everything had to work, or nothing would. This was where Churchill saw danger most clearly. Strategy, he believed, should constrain risk, not concentrate it. By extending the operation to its furthest limit, planners had transformed a bold maneuver into a wager. Not a reckless one, but a wager nonetheless, placed against weather, distance, and enemy reaction. In doing so, strategy quietly gave way to hope. Hope that German resistance would remain weak. Hope that weather would hold. Hope that delays would be minimal. Hope that airborne forces could endure isolation longer than planned. Hope that speed would compensate for vulnerability. These hopes were not unreasonable, but they were unprotected. Churchill distinguished sharply between confidence and hope. Confidence was earned through preparation and redundancy. Hope was what remained when protection ran out. Hope is not policy, he would later insist. not as cynicism, but as discipline. A plan that required hope to succeed was, in his view, already failing its duty. Market Garden, as executed, crossed that line. It asked too much of men placed too far forward, supported by too narrow a corridor, reliant on too many favorable conditions. It was not that the plan ignored risk, it accepted it without sufficient buffer. The extension removed the plan's ability to recover, turning friction into failure. Churchill did not deny the bravery involved. He never questioned the courage of airborne troops dropped deep into enemy territory, nor the determination of armored units pushing north under constant attack. But bravery, he believed, was a resource to be preserved, not spent to compensate for structural weakness. Courage could win battles. Only strategy could win wars. The consequences of ignoring that distinction were now visible, losses that could not be replaced. Time surrendered to an enemy who had been nearly broken, a winter campaign that need not have been fought. None of these outcomes were catastrophic, but together they reshaped the war's final chapter. Churchill's resistance to Market Garden was not opposition to action. It was resistance to fragility. He wanted pressure applied broadly and continuously, forcing Germany to respond everywhere at once. Market Garden concentrated effort into a single, narrow gamble. When it failed, there was no alternative ready to exploit the moment. In hindsight, this was not a failure of imagination, but of restraint. The vision was bold, the execution courageous. The flaw lay in believing that speed alone could replace resilience. Churchill had learned, often painfully, that wars punished such belief without hesitation. He never argued that Market Garden was foolish. He argued that it was unnecessary. The Allies were already winning. Time was on their side, provided they did not surrender it voluntarily. By reaching too far, they did not accelerate victory, they delayed it. This was why Churchill never wanted the risk. Not because it might fail, but because if it did, the cost would be measured not just in men and ground, but in time itself. And time, once lost, could never be recaptured. The lesson he carried forward was simple and severe. Strategy must outlast optimism. When it does not, hope fills the gap. And hope, however sincere, is never a substitute for policy. In the years that followed, Operation Market Garden was not remembered as a victory narrowly missed, but as a lesson painfully earned. It did not stand alongside Normandy or the liberation of Paris as a defining triumph. Instead, it occupied a quieter place in history, a moment when momentum tempted judgment and ambition moved faster than resilience could sustain. No one questioned the courage involved. The airborne troops who dropped into the Netherlands fought with discipline and endurance long after relief should have arrived. Ground forces advanced along an exposed corridor under constant threat, repairing bridges and clearing resistance mile by mile. Their determination carried the operation further than caution alone ever could have. But courage, however extraordinary, was never the variable in doubt. Judgment was, and judgment, unlike bravery, is revealed only after events have passed. At the heart of Market Garden lay a single decision, the choice to extend the operation to Arnhem, to reach for finality rather than advantage. That extension did not change the spirit of the plan. It changed its structure. It removed flexibility, narrowed margins, and converted delay into defeat. What had been bold but survivable became fragile, dependent on uninterrupted success. This distinction mattered. War rewards audacity, but it punishes fragility. Plans that cannot absorb error invite disaster not through enemy genius, but through inevitability. Market Garden did not fail because German resistance was overwhelming. It failed because the plan could not survive interruption. Once time slipped, there was nothing left to compensate. Churchill had seen this danger before. He had watched campaigns collapse not from lack of effort, but from excess confidence. He understood that momentum was not a substitute for structure, and that speed without redundancy was simply exposure moving quickly. His resistance to Market Garden was rooted not in pessimism, but in memory. History confirmed that instinct. The operation did not cost the Allies the war, but it changed its rhythm. The sense that Germany might collapse suddenly was replaced by the knowledge that the end would be fought for mile by mile, through winter and into another year. The tempo slowed. The cost rose. The opportunity that had briefly existed after Normandy did not return in the same form. Market Garden became a case study taught not for its execution, but for its assumption. It demonstrated how easily success can narrow perspective, how confidence can suppress dissent, and how belief, once shared widely enough, can override restraint. The plan was not irrational. It was incomplete. What followed was not blame, but reckoning. Allied strategy adjusted. Operations became layered with contingencies. Redundancy returned to planning. Pressure was applied broadly rather than concentrated narrowly. The war resumed its grind, and eventually victory came, but chastened by experience. Churchill never claimed prescience. He did not argue that the outcome was inevitable, only that the risk was unnecessary. The Allies were winning already. Time, if respected, favored them. By attempting to shorten the war through a single decisive stroke, they surrendered the very advantage that had carried them so far. The moral weight of Market Garden lies there, not in failure, but in choice. The decision to extend ambition beyond what the plan could endure transformed possibility into gamble. And gambles, however calculated, obey a different logic than strategy. They offer speed at the price of control. In war, that price is rarely paid immediately. It accumulates, quietly, steadily, in lost men, lost time, and lost options. Market Garden paid that price not in collapse, but in consequence. The war went on. The cost increased. The lesson remained. History did not judge the operation harshly because it failed. It judged it carefully because it revealed something enduring. That success can be as dangerous as defeat if it encourages certainty where caution is required. That momentum, once mistaken for inevitability, becomes a liability, and that the most dangerous moment in any campaign is often the one where victory seems closest. Market Garden did not erase Allied superiority, but it reminded them that superiority must still be managed, that wars are not ended by boldness alone, but by judgment disciplined enough to restrain it. In the end, the story resolves not with condemnation, but with clarity. A bold plan was transformed by a single decision into a gamble. The men who carried it out did everything asked of them. The structure they were given could not do the same. Churchill understood this truth long before Arnhem. History merely confirmed it. They reached for speed when endurance would have sufficed. They chose ambition over resilience. And in doing so, they changed the war's tempo, not by losing it, but by learning at lasting cost where its limits truly lay. They turned a bold plan into a gamble. And they paid the price for ignoring caution.